Welcome to Boring History and Stories. Thank you for being here. On this channel, we explore history through long, quiet storytelling. These are calm, in-depth narratives meant for relaxed listening, whether you are winding down, resting, or preparing to fall asleep. If you enjoy this style of slow, thoughtful history, you're welcome to subscribe so you can find more stories like this in the future. In this episode, we'll revisit one of the most important events in history, the fall of Constantinople, told from the Ottoman point of view. Rather than focusing on the city itself, we'll follow the story as it unfolded beyond the walls through the life and ambitions of a young ruler named Mehmet II. This is the story of how the Ottomans prepared to do what no one else could. By the early 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer an emerging power. It had already become a structured, disciplined, and resilient state, shaped by decades of expansion across Anatolia and southeastern Europe. What had once been a small frontier principality had transformed generation by generation into an empire that spanned continents. The Ottomans were experienced rulers by this point in their history. They had learned, often through hardship, that conquest alone was not enough to sustain power. Territory had to be governed, populations had to be integrated, order had to follow ambition. This understanding defined the Ottoman worldview. By the time Mehmet II was born in 1432, the empire already controlled much of Anatolia and the Balkans. Ottoman armies had crossed the Bosphorus decades earlier, establishing a strong presence in Europe. Major cities had fallen under their rule. Trade routes were secured, and rival powers had been weakened or absorbed. Yet at the center of this expanding world stood a city that remained unconquered, Constantinople. The city was surrounded by Ottoman territory on nearly every side, but it continued to exist as a reminder of a different age. Once the capital of the Roman and Byzantine empires, Constantinople still held immense symbolic power. Its walls had resisted attack for nearly 1,000 years. Its position between Europe and Asia made it strategically vital, and its survival challenged the idea that the Ottomans were the true heirs to imperial authority. At the head of the empire during Mehmet's early life was his father, Sultan Murad II. Murad II was an experienced and cautious ruler. He had spent much of his reign stabilizing the empire, rather than pursuing reckless expansion. He fought wars when necessary, and negotiated peace when it served Ottoman interests. Under his leadership, the empire grew stronger, more organized, and more secure. Murad II had faced Constantinople before. He understood its importance and its danger. He knew that a failed siege could weaken the empire and invite foreign intervention. Rather than risking everything on an uncertain assault, he chose a more deliberate strategy: surround the city, isolate it, and allow time to work in the Ottomans' favor. As a result, Constantinople gradually became an island of the past within a sea of Ottoman territory. This reality shaped Mehmet from an early age. Mehmet received an education befitting a future ruler. He was taught languages, including Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin. He studied theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and military science. He read histories of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and the Roman emperors. Through these studies, he developed a deep awareness of how power was built and how it was remembered. More than anything, Mehmet studied empire. Contemporary accounts describe him as serious, focused, and unusually determined. He was not known for excessive indulgence or impulsive behavior. Instead, he listened closely, observed carefully, and reflected deeply on the lessons of history. As a teenager, Mehmet was placed on the throne while his father temporarily withdrew from rule. This early reign proved difficult. Rebellions erupted. Advisors struggled to maintain order. Murad II was ultimately forced to return and reassume power. For many young rulers, such an experience would have been discouraging. For Mehmet, it was instructive. He learned that authority could not be symbolic. It had to be enforced. He learned that youth invited doubt, and that legitimacy required undeniable achievement. And he learned that as long as Constantinople stood unconquered, the Ottoman Empire would always appear incomplete. When Mehmet finally reclaimed the throne permanently in 1451, he was only 19 years old, but he inherited a stable and powerful state. The empire was wealthy, organized, and militarily experienced. It was not struggling to survive. It was waiting. To Mehmet, the next step was clear. Constantinople was not merely a target. It was the final barrier between the Ottomans and unquestioned imperial authority. Its continued existence represented a challenge to Ottoman dominance over trade, diplomacy, and legitimacy. Yet the city was not an easy conquest. The Theodosian walls, massive layered fortifications reinforced by towers and moats, were among the strongest defensive structures ever built. The Golden Horn, protected by a heavy chain, blocked naval access. The city's location between sea and land made coordinated assaults difficult. Many commanders believed Constantinople was effectively unconquerable. Mehmet did not. Rather than rushing into battle, he began preparing with patience and precision. He understood that the city could not be taken through force alone. It would require engineering, logistics, and psychological pressure on a scale never before attempted. One of his first major steps was securing the Bosphorus. On the European side of the strait, Mehmet ordered the construction of Rumeli Hisarı, a massive fortress built in astonishingly short time. Its purpose was to cut Constantinople off from external support by sea. With this single act, Mehmet demonstrated his approach, not confrontation, but enclosure. The Byzantines protested, envoys were sent, warnings were issued. Mehmet ignored them. Within the Ottoman court, opinions were divided. Some advisors supported the plan, believing the moment had finally arrived. Others urged caution, warning of European intervention and prolonged resistance. Mehmet listened carefully and continued. He gathered engineers, metalworkers, and artillery specialists. He invested heavily in cannon design, commissioning weapons powerful enough to challenge walls that had stood for centuries. Supplies were stockpiled, roads were improved, transport networks were organized. This was not the behavior of an impulsive conqueror. It was the behavior of a ruler who believed that history had already decided the outcome, and that preparation was simply the final step. By the early 1450s, the Ottoman Empire stood at a turning point. Behind it lay generations of expansion and consolidation. Ahead of it stood a city that symbolized everything yet to be claimed. And at its center stood Mehmet II, young, educated, and unwavering, convinced that the walls of Constantinople were not eternal. They were simply waiting. By the winter of 1451, it had become clear to those within the Ottoman court that Sultan Mehmet II was no longer considering whether Constantinople should be taken. In his mind, the question had already been answered. What remained was how and when. Constantinople had survived not because it was wealthy or populous, but because it was designed to endure siege. Its defenses were the product of centuries of refinement. The city's greatest strength lay in its walls, particularly the Theodosian walls on the landward side. These fortifications consisted of multiple layers: a deep moat, an outer wall, and a massive inner wall reinforced by towers. Any attacking force would have to cross open ground under constant fire, breach multiple barriers, and maintain pressure for weeks or even months. Previous attackers had failed not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked patience and resources. Mehmet understood this. Rather than seeing the walls as an obstacle, he treated them as a problem to be solved through planning and innovation. He did not intend to test the city's defenses in a single decisive moment. He intended to wear them down, slowly, methodically, and relentlessly. One of the most significant elements of Mehmet's plan was artillery. Gunpowder weapons were not new in the 15th century, but their use in large-scale siege warfare was still evolving. Earlier, cannons had been unreliable, difficult to transport, and often more dangerous to their operators than to their targets. Mehmet believed this could be changed. He sought out specialists, men who understood metal, pressure, and design. Among them was a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who claimed he could build cannons large enough to damage even Constantinople's legendary walls. Mehmet listened carefully, funded the experiments, and provided the resources necessary to turn theory into reality. The result was unprecedented. Massive bronze cannons were cast, some so large that they required teams of oxen to move them. Their construction took months. Their transport required careful planning. Roads were reinforced, bridges were strengthened. Every detail was considered. This was not spectacle, it was preparation. At the same time, Mehmet worked to ensure that the siege would not be interrupted from outside. Diplomatic efforts were made to neutralize potential threats. Treaties were signed. Assurances were given. Mehmet understood that a prolonged siege would only succeed if the Ottomans could focus entirely on the city without fear of attack elsewhere. Within the empire, resources were mobilized on a scale rarely seen before. Grain was collected, weapons were distributed, soldiers were assembled from across Anatolia and the Balkans. These men were not hastily gathered raiders, but disciplined units accustomed to long campaigns. They knew how to wait, how to endure hardship, and how to follow orders. Life in the Ottoman camps was structured and controlled. Days followed predictable rhythms. Supplies were rationed. Prayers were observed. Equipment was maintained. Mehmet insisted on order, knowing that disorder would undermine morale long before the city's defenses weakened. This discipline extended to strategy. Rather than launching immediate attacks, Mehmet focused on positioning. Camps were established carefully, ensuring access to water and supply routes. The city was gradually encircled. Constantinople was not attacked, it was isolated. Inside the city, the effect was psychological. Byzantine defenders could see the preparations unfolding day by day. The construction of Rumeli Hisara had already demonstrated Mehmet's intent. Now, the steady accumulation of men, equipment, and artillery made that intent unmistakable. The Ottomans were not leaving. Within Mehmet's council, doubts persisted. Some senior commanders worried about the size of the cannons, the strain on logistics, and the risk of failure. They reminded the Sultan that Constantinople had defeated far greater forces in the past. Mehmet listened, and then reminded them of something important. Those forces had never been this prepared. As winter turned to spring, final preparations accelerated. Cannons were tested, roads were cleared, signals were established. Mehmet personally inspected the camps, reinforcing his authority through presence rather than command alone. He was not distant, he was visible. To the soldiers, this mattered. A young ruler who shared their hardships earned loyalty. Mehmet's confidence became contagious. The belief that history was about to change spread quietly through the ranks. Yet one major obstacle remained: the Golden Horn. This sheltered harbour protected Constantinople's northern flank and allowed supplies to reach the city by sea. A massive iron chain stretched across its entrance, preventing enemy ships from entering. As long as the Golden Horn remained secure, the city could be reinforced and resupplied. Many commanders viewed this as an insurmountable problem. Mehmet did not. Rather than attempting to break the chain directly, he began considering alternatives. He studied the terrain. He consulted engineers. He thought not in terms of attack, but in terms of movement. The idea that emerged was audacious. If the ships could not enter the Golden Horn by sea, they would enter by land. Preparations were made quietly. A route was selected. Logs were laid. Grease was applied to reduce friction. The operation would require coordination, strength, and secrecy. It was not a dramatic act of violence. It was an act of engineering. When the ships were finally moved overland and launched into the Golden Horn behind the city's defenses, the effect was immediate. The defenders were stunned. The city's sense of security was shattered. A barrier thought permanent had been bypassed through patience and ingenuity. From the Ottoman perspective, this moment confirmed something essential. The city was not invincible. It could be outthought. As spring deepened, Mehmet knew the moment was approaching. The preparations were complete. The city was isolated. The walls had been tested. Supplies were secure. Morale was high. Still, he waited. Because Mehmet understood something many conquerors did not. Timing mattered as much as strength. The siege would not be won through haste. It would be won through endurance. And when the moment finally came, it would come not as a reckless charge, but as the natural conclusion of months and years of preparation. The decision did not come suddenly. For weeks, Sultan Mehmet II had watched Constantinople in silence. From the hills beyond the city, he could see the walls rising in layers, stone upon stone, tower after tower, unchanged, unmoving, as they had been for generations. The city looked eternal from a distance, as if it had always been there and always would be. But Mehmet knew better. He had studied the city too closely to believe in its permanence. He knew its population was small. He knew its treasury was thin. He knew its allies were distant, divided, or unwilling. And most importantly, he knew that time no longer favored Constantinople. Still, he waited. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos had already accepted what was coming. There was no illusion that Mehmet would abandon his preparations. The construction of Rumeli Hisara alone had made that impossible. The fortress stood like a clenched fist along the Bosphorus, cutting the city off from help and reminding everyone who looked upon it that the Ottomans were no longer content to surround Constantinople. Constantine had ruled long enough to understand the limits of diplomacy. Envoys were sent, appeals were made to Western powers, messages crossed seas and borders asking for aid, ships, soldiers, anything. But Europe was distracted. Kingdoms argued among themselves. Promises were made slowly, cautiously, and often without urgency. Inside the city, the emperor prepared with what he had. The walls were inspected, supplies were counted and rationed. Every able-bodied man was assigned a position. Mercenaries were hired, including the experienced Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, whose presence offered some reassurance. The city had survived sieges before. The walls had never fallen. Many believed they would hold again. On the Ottoman side, the mood was different. The camps outside Constantinople were vast and orderly. Tents stretched across the fields in careful rows. Supply wagons moved steadily along prepared routes. Soldiers drilled, prayed, rested, and waited. There was no rush, no panic, no sense of uncertainty. Mehmet moved through the camp frequently, silent and observant. He spoke little, but his presence alone carried weight. This was not a ruler hiding behind advisors. He was seen, recognized, remembered. When the final decision came, it was delivered without ceremony. Orders were issued quietly. Units were positioned. Artillery crews prepared their cannons. Scouts were sent out. Signals were arranged. The siege would begin. When the first cannon fired, the sound rolled across the land like thunder. Inside Constantinople, people froze. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Birds scattered from rooftops. Dust fell from ceilings. The noise echoed through streets and courtyards, startling even those who had expected it. The Ottomans had begun. From the walls, defenders watched as smoke rose from the Ottoman artillery positions. The cannons were enormous, larger than anything they had seen before. Each shot took time to prepare, time to load, time to fire. But when the projectiles struck the walls, stone cracked. Not collapsed, not yet, but cracked. For Mehmet, this was enough. He did not expect the walls to fall quickly. He expected them to weaken. Each shot was a message. This siege will not end tomorrow or the next day, or even the next week. Inside the city, the response was immediate. Repair crews were organized. Stones were hauled into place. Earth and timber were packed into damaged sections. Night after night, while the Ottomans rested, Byzantine defenders worked under torchlight, rebuilding what had been struck down during the day. At first, morale held. The walls still stood. The breaches were repaired. The city had endured worse, or so people told themselves. Mehmet observed all of this with patience. He adjusted the cannons slowly, changing angles, distances, timing. He allowed the defenders to grow accustomed to the bombardment, and then intensified it. Not continuously, but rhythmically. Predictability gave way to uncertainty. Inside the Ottoman camp, discipline remained strict. There would be no reckless assaults, no uncontrolled attacks. Mehmet forbade premature engagements. Soldiers were reminded constantly that this was not a raid, but a conquest. The city was to be taken intact. This restraint confused the defenders. They expected waves of attacks. Instead, they faced pressure without release. The cannon spoke, then fell silent. Days passed, nights followed. Fatigue accumulated. Constantine XI walked the walls often. He spoke to soldiers, reassured citizens, prayed with clergy. He knew the truth, even if he did not speak it openly. This time was different. The cannons were unlike anything the city had faced before. And worse still, the Ottomans were not growing impatient. They were growing confident. The moment that truly unsettled Constantinople came without warning. One morning, defenders looked out over the Golden Horn and saw Ottoman ships where none should have been. Behind the chain, inside the harbor. The impossible had happened. From the Ottoman side, the operation had been planned in silence. Mehmet had approved it personally. Ships had been hauled over land on greased logs, moved slowly through the night by coordinated teams. There was no celebration when they reached the water. Only satisfaction. Inside Constantinople, panic rippled through the population. The Golden Horn had been considered untouchable. Now it was compromised. The city was surrounded not only by land, but by sea. Constantine knew what this meant. Every defense the city relied upon had been tested and bypassed. Still, the city did not fall. The defenders fought on. Sorties were launched, repairs continued, prayers were held. Hope flickered, stubborn and fragile. Mehmet allowed this. He understood that cities rarely fell when defenders still believed. They fell when belief eroded. As days turned into weeks, exhaustion took hold on both sides. But the difference was subtle and decisive. The Ottomans were prepared for this duration. The city was not. Supplies dwindled. Sleep became scarce. Every cannon blast reminded the defenders that the walls were weakening faster than they could be repaired. Mehmet began to consult his commanders more frequently. The moment was approaching. The walls had been tested, the harbor breached, morale strained. Intelligence reports suggested that the defenders were near their limits. Still, Mehmet did not rush. He waited for certainty. And in the quiet moments before dawn, as the city slept fitfully and the Ottoman camp lay hushed beneath the stars, Mehmet made his decision. The final assault would come soon, but not yet. The night before the final assault was unusually quiet. Outside the walls of Constantinople, the Ottoman camp lay still beneath the stars. Fires burned low. Horses stood tethered without movement. Soldiers spoke in hushed voices, or not at all. Many had already prayed. Some slept lightly, knowing they would soon be awakened. At the center of it all, Sultan Mehmet II remained awake. He sat with maps spread before him, lit by the soft glow of a lamp. The walls of Constantinople were marked carefully. Breaches were noted, weak points circled. Reports from scouts and commanders lay beside him, each confirming what he already knew. The city was at its limit. For weeks the walls had been struck again and again. Each day they were damaged. Each night they were repaired. But stone and mortar could not endure forever. The defenders were exhausted. Their numbers were thinning. Their hope, though still present, had become fragile. Mehmet did not see this moment as triumph. He saw it as responsibility. He knew that what happened next would be remembered for centuries, not only by those who won, but by those who lost. History would not care how long he had waited or how carefully he had planned. It would remember the result. Before dawn, Mehmet gave the order. The assault would begin in waves. The first wave would test the defenders one final time, forcing them to commit their remaining strength. The second would press harder, exploiting every weakness. The third would decide everything. As the night began to fade into early morning, horns sounded across the Ottoman camp. Inside Constantinople, defenders heard them almost immediately. The sound echoed through streets and courtyards, reaching even those who had managed to sleep. Men rose quickly. Weapons were taken up. Armor was fastened with shaking hands. Priests moved among the soldiers, offering blessings and prayers. Emperor Constantine XI was already awake. He had spent much of the night in prayer. He knew there would be no relief, no miracle, no sudden intervention from abroad. Whatever happened today would happen with the men who stood beside him now. Constantine put on his armor and went to the walls. He spoke briefly to those around him, not with grand speeches, but with calm words. He reminded them that they were defending not just a city, but centuries of history. He thanked them. He stood with them. As the first wave of Ottoman troops advanced, the sky was still dim. The initial attacks were fierce but measured. Mehmet had ordered restraint even now. The goal was not reckless breakthrough, but exhaustion. Defenders fought back with everything they had left. Arrows flew, stones were dropped, oil was poured. For a time, it seemed as though the walls might hold. Yet again, inside the city, hope flickered. But Mehmet watched carefully. He saw how slowly the defenders moved now, how thin their lines had become, how often they had to pause, to breathe, to steady themselves. When the first wave withdrew, it was not a retreat. It was a signal. The second wave advanced with greater force, more men, more pressure. The cannons fired again, shaking the weakened sections of the walls. Dust rose, stone fell. Repair crews struggled to keep up. Then came a moment that would decide everything. Near a smaller gate, later known as the Kirkeporta, confusion spread. Whether through exhaustion, miscommunication, or simple chance, the defenses there faltered. Ottoman soldiers pressed forward. A breach opened, not wide, but enough. Enough was all that was needed. As word spread through the Ottoman ranks, momentum surged. Mehmet ordered the final wave forward. This was the moment he had waited for. The elite troops advanced with discipline and purpose. Resistance remained fierce, but it was no longer coordinated. Inside the city, defenders began to realize what was happening. The walls were no longer secure. Constantine XI fought on foot among his men. Accounts differ on his final moments, but all agree on one thing. He did not flee. He chose to stand where the city was falling. As Ottoman forces entered Constantinople, the sound of battle echoed through streets that had known peace for centuries. Smoke drifted upward, bells rang, cries filled the air, and then, gradually, the resistance collapsed. Mehmet did not rush into the city immediately. He waited. Only once order could be imposed did he enter. He rode through the gates slowly, observing the city in silence. Buildings stood damaged but intact. Streets were filled with people stunned by what had happened. The city was not destroyed, it was transformed. When Mehmet reached Hagia Sophia, he dismounted. This was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of transition. He ordered that the building be protected. He issued commands restoring order throughout the city. Guards were posted. Violence was curtailed. Administration began almost immediately. Mehmet declared Constantinople the capital of his empire. Not a trophy, a center. In the days that followed, the city settled into a strange quiet. Fires were extinguished. Markets slowly reopened. People emerged cautiously from homes and churches. Life, battered but unbroken, resumed. Mehmet moved quickly to stabilize the city. Religious leaders were appointed. Communities were reassured. Settlers were invited from across the empire. The goal was not emptiness, but renewal. Constantinople did not vanish. It became something new. For the Ottomans, the conquest confirmed what Mehmet had believed since his youth, that preparation, patience, and vision could reshape the world. The city that had resisted empires now stood at the heart of one. For the wider world, the fall of Constantinople marked the end of an age. Trade routes shifted, powers adjusted, history moved forward. But within the city itself, time continued quietly. Ships passed along the Bosphorus. Prayers were spoken. Children were born. Streets filled once more. As night falls over Constantinople, now Istanbul, the lights reflect softly on the water. The walls stand, no longer as barriers, but as witnesses to centuries of change. The city has been Roman. It has been Byzantine. It has become Ottoman. And through it all, it has endured. This was not the end of history. It was a turning point, one written not in haste, but in patience. A city taken, a city preserved, a world changed. The first morning after the conquest of Constantinople arrived quietly. There was no sudden transformation, no sweeping declaration that changed everything at once. Instead, the city awoke cautiously, as if unsure whether it was allowed to wake at all. Smoke still drifted through parts of the streets. Doors remained closed. Windows opened only slightly. The sound of footsteps echoed more than usual, as if every movement carried weight. For centuries, Constantinople had awakened as the capital of a Christian empire. Now, it awoke under Muslim rule. Sultan Mehmet II rose early that morning. He did not treat the day as a celebration. For him, the conquest had already passed. What mattered now was what came next. He understood something that many conquerors before him had not. A city taken by force could be lost again through neglect. His first concern was order. Guards were stationed throughout key districts. Soldiers were reminded that discipline was no longer optional. Looting, which had been permitted briefly under the customs of war, was now forbidden. Anyone caught violating these orders faced immediate punishment. These commands were not symbolic. They were enforced. Inside the city, this mattered deeply. Fear had spread quickly after the walls fell, but just as quickly, people began to notice something unexpected. The chaos did not continue. Streets were not abandoned to violence. Markets were not burned to the ground. The city, though wounded, was being protected. Mehmet moved through Constantinople slowly, observing rather than commanding. He saw churches damaged but standing, homes intact, streets familiar, though quieter than before. This was not a ruin to him. It was a capital in waiting. One of his earliest decisions concerned religion. The presence of Islam in Constantinople was immediate, but not overwhelming. The call to prayer was heard, but churches were not closed en masse. Mehmet knew that sudden religious suppression would fracture the city further. Instead, he chose a different approach, one rooted in pragmatism rather than force. He ordered that the Greek Orthodox Church would continue to exist. Within days, Mehmet appointed a new patriarch, granting him authority over the Orthodox Christian community. This decision was deliberate. It signaled continuity. Christians would be governed under their own religious leadership, allowed to worship, marry, and manage internal affairs according to their traditions. This system, later known as the millet system, was not yet fully formed, but its foundations were laid here, in the days following the conquest. For many Christians inside the city, this decision brought confusion and relief. They had feared conversion by force, exile, or destruction of their faith. Instead, they were told that their religion would be tolerated, their institutions preserved, and their community recognized. This did not mean equality. Muslims held political and legal authority. Taxes would differ. Status would change. But survival was possible. For the city's Jewish population, the new rule also carried significance. Jewish communities had lived in Constantinople for centuries, often under restriction and suspicion. Under Ottoman rule, they were granted a recognized place within the empire's structure. In time, many Jews expelled from Western Europe would find refuge here. But even in these early days, the city's Jewish residents recognized a shift. The new authority was not indifferent. It was organized. Mehmet's approach to governance became clearer with each passing day. He ordered a census. He wanted to know who remained in the city, which districts were populated, which were empty. Constantinople's population had declined drastically long before the siege. Mehmet understood that a capital could not function without people. So he acted. Families from across the Ottoman Empire were encouraged and sometimes required to relocate to Constantinople. Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike were brought in. Artisans, merchants, scholars, builders. Each arrival added movement, sound, and life back into the city. This was not generosity alone. It was strategy. Mehmet did not want Constantinople to be merely conquered. He wanted it to thrive. A living city was easier to govern, easier to tax, easier to defend. Markets began to reopen. Trade resumed slowly. Ships once again moved through the Bosphorus. The rhythms of daily life, disrupted but not destroyed, began to return. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. For some former elites, the fall of the Byzantine Empire meant the end of status, influence, and security. Properties were reassigned. Titles lost meaning. Wealth shifted hands. Grief lingered quietly in corners of the city. Mehmet was aware of this. He did not seek universal approval. He sought stability. His justice was firm but calculated. Punishments were clear. Rewards were deliberate. Loyalty was encouraged, not demanded blindly. Those who cooperated found space within the new order. Those who resisted openly were removed. To many, Mehmet appeared distant, even cold. But to others, he was something different. He was predictable. In a city accustomed to uncertainty, predictability mattered. Within weeks, Mehmet formally declared Constantinople the capital of the Ottoman Empire. This was not a symbolic gesture. It reshaped the empire's center of gravity. Resources flowed toward the city. Architects were commissioned. Administrative offices were established. Hagia Sophia, now a mosque, became a symbol of the new era. But Mehmet ordered that its transformation be respectful. Mosaics were covered, not destroyed. The structure was preserved. This choice reflected Mehmet's broader philosophy. He did not erase the past. He absorbed it. The city's Roman and Byzantine legacy was not rejected. It was incorporated into a new imperial identity. Mehmet studied Roman law, admired classical learning, and saw himself not as a destroyer of empire, but as its successor. Some called him ruthless, others called him visionary. Most simply learned to live under his rule. As days turned into weeks, fear slowly gave way to routine. People walked streets again without hesitation. Children played in courtyards. Shopkeepers negotiated prices. Life, altered but continuing, settled into a new rhythm. Constantinople was no longer what it had been, but it was still alive. As the months passed, Constantinople began to change in ways that were subtle at first, almost unnoticeable to those living through them. The fear that had gripped the city in the immediate aftermath of the conquest did not vanish overnight. It softened gradually, like tension easing from a clenched hand. People still spoke quietly in public spaces. Doors were still bolted at night. But life no longer felt suspended. It was moving again. For many residents, the most surprising realization was that daily routines returned faster than expected. Markets reopened fully. Fishermen returned to familiar waters. Artisans resumed work in workshops that had stood for generations. The city's streets, once echoing with silence, filled again with the sound of footsteps, voices, and commerce. Under Ottoman rule, the structure of life became clearer with each passing week. New laws were announced, but they were not endless or confusing. Taxes were standardized. Property rights were recorded. Disputes were brought before courts that followed defined procedures. To some, these systems felt foreign. To others, they felt reassuring. What mattered most was consistency. Sultan Mehmet II ruled not through constant presence, but through institutions. He did not patrol the streets or deliver speeches to crowds. Instead, he governed through administrators, judges, and appointed leaders who carried his authority into every district. This distance was intentional. Mehmet believed that a ruler who interfered constantly created instability. Order, once established, needed space to function. For Christians in the city, daily life under Ottoman rule was marked by adjustment rather than disappearance. Churches continued to operate. Religious festivals were observed. Families married, baptized children, and buried the dead according to tradition. They were no longer the ruling community, but they were not erased. The Orthodox Patriarch served as both religious leader and intermediary between the Christian population and the Ottoman state. Through him, grievances were raised, disputes addressed, and boundaries negotiated. This system did not remove inequality, but it offered structure. Many Christians learned slowly how to live within it. For Jewish communities, the change brought cautious optimism. Under Byzantine rule, Jews had often lived at the margins. Under Ottoman administration, they were formally recognized as a protected community. Their religious practices were allowed, their leadership acknowledged. In the years that followed, Jewish refugees expelled from Spain and other parts of Europe would find safety in Ottoman lands, including Constantinople. But even in these early months, the city began to feel more diverse, more layered than it had been for centuries. For Muslims arriving in the city, soldiers, officials, scholars, families, Constantinople felt both familiar and foreign. Mosques were established, Islamic schools were founded, charitable foundations were created to support the poor, the elderly, and travelers. Yet even as Islam became more visible, it did not overwhelm the city's character. Mehmet did not attempt to reshape Constantinople into something entirely new. Instead, he allowed it to evolve. Architecture reflected this approach. New buildings rose alongside old ones. Byzantine structures were repurposed rather than destroyed. Roads were repaired, aqueducts maintained. The city's infrastructure, inherited from earlier empires, was preserved and improved. This preservation was not accidental. Mehmet admired the civilizations that had ruled before him. He studied Roman history. He collected Greek manuscripts. He surrounded himself with scholars from different traditions. He did not see learning as a threat, but as a tool of rule. To those who interacted with him directly, Mehmet was complex. He could be stern, even unforgiving, when authority was challenged. Rebellions were crushed swiftly. Corruption was punished. Loyalty was rewarded, but never assumed. At the same time, he was curious, thoughtful, and deliberate. He asked questions. He listened. He planned. Some feared him, others respected him. Few misunderstood him. Was the population of Constantinople happy under Ottoman rule? The answer is complicated. Happiness is not a word that fits easily into periods of conquest and transition. What many felt was relief. Relief that the city still existed, that life continued, that faith was not extinguished, that order had returned. For those who lost status or privilege, the change was painful. For those who had lived under decades of uncertainty and decline, the new stability offered opportunity. Over time, a new generation would grow up knowing only Ottoman Constantinople. For them, the city's identity would not feel fractured. It would simply be what it was. Mehmet ruled Constantinople not as a conqueror passing through, but as a founder. He envisioned the city as a center of empire, culture, and trade. He wanted it to rival and surpass the great capitals of the past. And in many ways, it did. The city's population grew, its markets flourished, its influence spread across regions once divided by rivalry. Constantinople became Istanbul, not through declaration, but through lived reality. As years passed, memories of the siege softened into history. Stories were told, monuments remained. The walls stood, not as symbols of defeat, but as witnesses. Mehmet II would continue to rule with ambition and discipline until his death. His legacy would be debated by historians, admired by some, criticized by others. But one truth remained undeniable. Under his rule, Constantinople did not vanish. It endured. And as night settles once more over the city, lamps glow along the streets. Prayers rise from different places, spoken in different languages. The Bosphorus reflects the lights of ships passing between continents. The city breathes, empires change, rulers rise and fall. But places remember. Constantinople, Istanbul, stands as a city shaped not by a single moment, but by centuries of adaptation. This was not the end of one world. It was the beginning of another.